Ibrahim Al-Asil. I'm a senior fellow with the Middle East Institute, and it's my pleasure today to moderate this panel with three amazing speakers, Abdul-Wahab Kayyali, Sahar Khamis, and Salwa Zarhouni. So this panel comes in a series that is in cooperation between the Middle East Institute and the Arab Barometer on the occasion of the publication of the Arab Barometer's findings from the sixth wave of its surveys. This most recent poll was conducted in the wake of the outbreak of COVID-19 and assessed regional perspectives on the impact of the pandemic on public health, domestic conditions, vulnerable populations, and the way the region sees the outside world. This panel brings together experts from the US and Middle East alongside Abdul-Wahab Kayyali, senior research specialist with the Arab Barometer, to discuss the findings relevant to domestic conditions in the region. What have been the views of government throughout the pandemic and ongoing crises? How are the economic conditions, and in what ways has the change of the global work conditions impacted regional populations? What are the perceptions of civil liberty and freedoms? Those are the types of questions that we will try to answer today in the next 58 to 59 minutes. And I know that's challenging, so I'm not gonna take a lot of time. I'm gonna very quickly just introduce our speakers with the main titles, and you can find their bios on the website. Abdul-Wahab joined the Arab Barometer as a senior research specialist in 2018. And prior to that, he obtained a doctorate in political science from the George Washington University in the US. Dr. Sahar Khamis is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, and Salwa Zarhouni is the president of the Rabat Institute for Social Science. We will start with Abdul-Wahab for about 15 minutes to go through the presentation of the findings. Then we will move to some commentary from Sahar and Salwa in 5 to 7 minutes. And finally, we'll move to your questions. And I will have the pleasure to field your questions to the speakers. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat box at any moment. And it would be very useful if you direct your question to one of the panelists, but also feel free to leave that open. With that, Abdul-Wahab, the floor is yours. Please share with us your findings in the presentation.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Thanks to the Middle East Institute for organizing this event. I'm happy to share the latest findings of the Arab Barometer with you with a specific focus on domestic conditions. I'll be sharing my screen right now, and let's see. I hope everybody can see my screen right now. So I have a lot of material to cover, so I'll be going at it at a relatively quick pace. So I hope that if there are any questions about specific findings, we can go back and we can review them. But for now, I'll start with just talking a little bit about the Arab Barometer. The Arab Barometer is the longest standing and largest repository of publicly available data on citizens' views in the MENA region. For wave 6, we switched to a new mode. The COVID-19 pandemic forced us to conduct our surveys via phone, as opposed to face-to-face surveys, which we usually carry out. We did this in order to meet public health restrictions and public health requirements in all the countries that we carried out the surveys in, and in order not to endanger any of our interviewees or our interviewers. The phone survey necessitated that we carry out shorter surveys because attention spans on the phone are not as long as they are in person. And so our interviews were approximately 20 minutes each when we carried them out. This is, a large contrast to the face-to-face survey, which typically takes 45 minutes. And so what we tried to do in order to manage it is we sampled around 1,000 interviewees per survey using random digital dialing. And we carried out 3 surveys per country for most of the surveyed countries from the summer of 2020 until the spring of 2021. So this actually allowed us to track some changes within the survey period, which I will be sharing with you today on questions that we repeatedly asked across the 3 surveys. The surveyed countries included Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Kuwait. And if there are any other questions on methodology, please feel free to consult our website, where we have more information on dates and numbers and the rest of the methodology. The key findings from the domestic side is that the economy and COVID-19 were the most important challenges facing regional countries, according to the citizens of these countries. Despite large variation, minorities have a positive view of their current economic conditions. And with the exception of two countries, which are Morocco and Libya, minorities envision a more positive economic horizon, and majorities fear loss of income. Sizable proportions wish to emigrate, particularly among the educated youth, and economic reasons are among the most important reasons for that. With regards to government trust, minorities trust the government across the region, and overwhelming majorities believe corruption is prevalent. With regards to freedoms, perceptions of freedoms are declining, particularly notably in more free countries, with notable proportions supporting restrictions during emergencies. So during COVID-19, we've noticed that there is actually an appetite for restricting freedoms. And finally, social media is becoming the primary source for breaking news, which forces most of the stakeholders in the region to pay more attention to it. So with that, I will go to specific findings now. As narrated before, the economy and COVID-19 were the most important challenges identified by citizens of these countries. And so, there's a large variance between Lebanon and Libya, but the economy was identified as the most important challenge, with a plurality of respondents across the different countries identifying it as such. That perception is changing across the survey period, with some countries such as Algeria, having a rising perception of the economy being a challenge, whereas in other countries it's declining, such as Lebanon, for example, which is facing other problems. COVID-19 was the second most important challenge, and actually in Jordan and Morocco, citizens identified it as a more important challenge than the economic situation. But that also changed across time, across the survey period, where, for example, in Algeria, it dropped as a consideration, whereas in other countries, such as Jordan, it rose. And so with regarding views of the economy, with the exception of Morocco, minorities have a positive view of their economies. Minorities say that the current economic situation is very good or good. We see that Morocco has 63%, but it is very much an outlier in terms of the other countries. And actually in Morocco, the perception of the economy is improving across the survey period, which tracks with the way the country managed the COVID-19 outbreak. It had one of the more successful efforts in managing the outbreak and in vaccination right now. Predictions of future relief vary, and majorities fear loss of income. With the exception of Libya and Morocco, minorities predict that their economic situation will be better in 2 to 3 years. And when we asked, at the beginning of almost at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, we asked whether citizens were concerned about their loss of income in the next 12 months, and majorities across all countries expressed that concern. And that concern was perhaps not surprisingly more acute among low earners and women. And here we see the demographic splits across the different criteria that we ask. We split our data according to gender, income, age, and educational attainment. And we can see that lower income earners are not surprisingly more concerned, but also that women are more concerned about the loss of their income in the next 12 months. The dire economic situation is impacting food consumption. We included in the survey some questions that are asked by the United Nations and other international agencies about food security. And we see that notable proportions express having to rely on less expensive and less preferred food and needing financial support for getting food in the past 7 days. And these are stifling figures, especially in comparison to other regions of the world. And then also the anxiety is palpable in worrying about food running out or that money would run out to replace food that runs out. And so these are very concerning figures and ones that should be prioritized by policymakers across the region. Not surprisingly, the most vulnerable segments express the most concern, the most anxiety about food running out. So we have lower income earners and those who have less education expressing much more concern about food security across all the metrics that we measured. And so again, COVID-19 increased the exposure of marginalized communities and those who are disenfranchised. As far as what the government can do to alleviate the economic situation, the main government action to alleviate the economic conditions was identified as job creation across the countries. And the second most important one was lowering the cost of living, particularly in Lebanon, which is witnessing hyperinflation on measures that we haven't seen before. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as a result of the economic situation, substantial proportions have expressed the desire to immigrate. And this is a controversial question because if you're asking about immigration during COVID-19, where travel restrictions are unprecedented, perhaps in the past few decades, still, notable proportions in Lebanon, Tunisia, Iraq, and Jordan expressed the desire to immigrate. And the reasons for wanting to immigrate were identified primarily as economic reasons. The exception is Lebanon, and not because the Lebanese identified their economic situation as favorable, but because there were other priorities or other reasons for immigrating from Lebanon that were identified, such as corruption, political reasons, educational opportunities, and security, all of which placed higher than just the economic situation. We see that with regards to desire to immigrate, unsurprisingly, the youth segment of those aged 18 to 29 expressed the largest desire to immigrate, and the splits are notable when one compares them with the rest of the population. Males also express a larger desire to immigrate, perhaps because of feelings of increased mobility on the part of males in the surveyed countries. But also there are notable splits with regards to education and income. So those who are more educated express a larger desire to immigrate. And finally, those who earn less also express a larger desire to immigrate. So if we wanted to profile the typical immigrant from these countries, it would be young males who are educated and cannot cover their expenses. Moving on to views of government, we can see that the trust in government is low and declining across the survey period. Perhaps it is highest in Morocco, where even there it is a minority. And so throughout the survey period, this is changing. And some countries it's stabilizing, others it's fluctuating vociferously. COVID-19 was widely viewed as a national security threat by majorities in the surveyed countries, and perhaps, again, unsurprisingly, more so by women than men, as women who are more concerned about public health emergencies. But at the same time, trust in government COVID statistics varied tremendously across the different countries. So only in Morocco and Jordan did we see that majorities trust the government reported statistics. This has various implications on government efforts to battle COVID. If the citizenry does not even believe the numbers, then the whole COVID-19 pandemic response is impacted. Evaluations of government response to COVID-19 vary tremendously. So, on the one hand, we see in Morocco, 86% say that the government response has been very good or good. Only in Algeria and Libya do majorities also express similar evaluations. Elsewhere, citizens were not so generous in their evaluations of their government's effort to combat COVID-19. And this changes greatly across the survey period. So, the prototypical cases here is that in Jordan, it starts out as almost the same level in Morocco at 75%, and then it drops to 47% as the pandemic situation gets worse, and the government management of the pandemic situation also is seen as getting worse, whereas in Morocco, it's going in the opposite direction. Evaluations of healthcare systems vary greatly. So in Jordan and Morocco, majorities are satisfied with the healthcare system. In other countries, not so much. But this is also changing tremendously across the survey period. So in Jordan, we have a drop from 76% to 57% expressing their satisfaction with the healthcare systems. And this is not surprising given that there were, public relations disasters with regards to the management of the COVID-19 pandemic and in public hospitals, specifically perhaps the Salt Hospital saga was the most acute of them. Evaluations of education systems are even less generous because COVID-19 placed a very heavy toll on education systems as students had to receive their learning from home, and families struggle to adjust. So we see that minorities across the region are completely satisfied or satisfied with their education systems. And in general, that satisfaction is declining across the survey period. Evaluations of price control also fluctuate. So on the one hand, we have Moroccans who evaluate price control positively, but everywhere else, these evaluations are not as positive. And finally, evaluations of government performance overall fluctuate. So in Morocco, Libya, Algeria, majorities are satisfied with their government performance. In other countries, not so much. And this is also changing across the survey period, notably in Algeria and in Jordan, where Jordan declined from 78% to 48%, which is a very steep decline in evaluations of government performance, reflecting not only the different government, but the evaluations of the new government that took control after November 2020. This is a very interesting slide, regardless of the challenges that the countries are dealing with. The overwhelming majorities say that their top spending priorities should be in healthcare and education. And this is not surprising, given the challenges that healthcare and education sectors faced in COVID-19. But also elsewhere in the world, we see that healthcare and education typically are the top priorities of government expenditure. And so this gives you a nice sense of how these priorities track across the different countries. With regards to corruption, the perceptions of corruption are high. Pretty much everywhere across the region, 3/4 of the population or more believe that corruption is prevalent in state institutions, and that there's not much change in that across the survey period, perhaps with the exception of Libya. But
sorry, Abdul-Wahab, sorry to interrupt. I have a quick question, and then
Sure.
if we could wrap up to give time to
Sure.
also Sahar and Salwa to comment. So when you're saying minorities in the beginning, the first slide, when you say minorities, sometimes we think ethnic or social minorities. Here you mean statistical minorities.
Statistical minorities. We are a statistics project, and are the only minorities we consider are numerical.
Yeah.
Ethnic, and they're
Right.
not. Yeah. So let me just wrap up quickly.
Please.
with views of freedom, I noted at the beginning that perceptions of freedom are lower in more free countries. The more free countries are Libya, Lebanon, Iraq. Perhaps the only exception to the more free countries is Tunisia, where perceptions of freedom are high and remain high. But they also change across the survey period to reflect the restrictions, perhaps, that governments have enacted on freedom of assembly and freedom of movement. And so, notably the freedom to participate in protests, is not evaluated very high and is declining across the survey period. At the same time, there is an appetite for restrictions during the public health emergency. We asked whether citizens favor government monitoring and tracing citizens' movements, censoring the media, limiting freedom of expression, and limiting freedom of movement. And there is an appetite for those restrictions during the emergency, reflecting that this doesn't really identify the seriousness of the situation. Lastly, I'll just go to media consumption very quickly. We see that internet usage is very high, and social media is considered a primary source for breaking news for notable segments of the populations, particularly the most educated and the youth. And so anybody who is dealing with communication strategies in these countries needs to have a social media plan and a social media strategy. I'll end with that, and thank you for listening. And I hope that wasn't too long, and looking forward to the discussion with my fellow co-panelists.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kayyali. I wish we had more time to hear more of your findings. But on to you, Dr. Khamis. You are an associate professor at the University of Maryland. You focus on communications and gender. So please share with us your thoughts on what you've just heard from those two angles in the next 6 to 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, and it's a pleasure to be with you in this important panel. Thanks to Middle East Institute and Arab Barometer for this opportunity. I am indeed an associate professor of communication and also affiliate professor of women's studies at the University of Maryland. So a lot of my work deals with these two areas of communication and gender, and these will be the two particular aspects that I would like to focus upon in my short comments today. So let's first start by agreeing that COVID-19 did not create many of these situations and many of these hardships that Abdul-Wahab has kindly explored and gave us some insight into in his presentation. But COVID-19 did indeed exacerbate and magnify many of these issues. In other words, it made bad situations become even worse, right? Whether economically or socially or politically, many of these hardships did exist before in the Arab world, in the MENA region at large, but the COVID-19 pandemic made them even clearer and made them even worse. So if we talk about, for example, marginalized groups, we will see that marginalized groups were hit the worst. And of course, women in many parts of the MENA region are considered, between brackets or between quotation marks, the poorest of the poor. So in many cases, they really have very big hardships in terms of their economic situation, in terms of access to healthcare systems, in terms of access to education. And many of these situations became even worse and became even exacerbated after the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you look, for example, at the social aspect, you will see that women are the primary caretakers in their own family. They're the ones who look after family members, and therefore they have more burdens on their shoulders, and they also have higher risk of being infected. They're also many times first responders, being working in the medical field, many times as nurses, medical assistants, and in some cases doctors. That means they're also at higher risk of being infected, while in many cases, if they are poor and marginalized, which is oftentimes the case, they have less access to healthcare system. So you see this one layer of disadvantage over another, as they say, it's piled up one layer over the other. If you look at the educational system, you will see that women also in many cases are marginalized, and they don't have the same degree of access to the educational system. In many cases, they have also higher illiteracy rate, higher alphabetical illiteracy, let alone digital illiteracy, which means they have real barriers to attaining education. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, that became even worse, because you cannot assume that everyone has access to 24/7 high-speed internet and therefore can have access to online learning and online teaching and online education. That means many girls were cut off from the educational system, and in many cases, unfortunately and sadly, they will not go back again to school, and they will not go back again to the educational system, meaning they will not be able to attain their high educational and professional goals and dreams. many cases they will end up in early marriages and maybe having more children, and that would be the end of it. So that's a very sad situation, sad reality for girls and women in this region. So in many cases, you see also in the economy, and Abdul-Wahab did talk about the economy being one of the biggest challenges that was obviously shared by the respondents in this particular survey and many other surveys as well. Of course, the economy is on everybody's mind. In the case of women in particular, they're always the hardest to hire and the easiest to fire, unfortunately. In other words, if you have a business that is closing down, they don't want to have so many employees, they want to get rid of some of their own workforce. It is always easier in this case, unfortunately, to get rid of women and to fire them first, which adds another layer of challenge economically as well to women's condition. So all of that really led to some kind of gender gap, which worked very much against women's interest economically and socially, culturally, educationally. They have been among the most hit, the hardest hit in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if you look at the communication aspect, Abdul-Wahab did talk about, for example, social media being a very important medium for communication in the midst of the pandemic. For all of us here, I am sure we are on our Zoom and Skype like 24/7, because we do have this kind of advantage. We have the technology, we have the digital literacy, but that is not the reality for everyone around the world. We have to face the reality of digital divide, which means the gap between the technological haves and have-nots. Those who have access to high-speed internet 24/7 and those who don't. Those who have the needed infrastructure and those who don't. Those who have digital literacy skills and those who don't. All of these are also harsh realities that we have to face and we have to confront. Now, that becomes even worse when you talk about marginalized groups. Again, for example, like the rural populations, people in remote areas, women in particular, the poor populations. All of these definitely do not have this kind of advantage of having access to high-speed internet, which means their situation even got worse. The digital divide became even bigger and clearer among many of these marginalized groups and populations, including women, creating what we call not just a digital divide, but also a gender digital divide or a gender digital gap, which adds to women's already disadvantaged status and worsening situation. Right? So that's another important reality. And please connect this to what I said earlier about education and online teaching and online learning, because if you don't have access to this type of infrastructure and this type of online access, that means you will also be cut off not just from social interaction, but also from educational services and employment opportunities. Now, I cannot make remarks about all of this without also mentioning something very important, which is the press freedom aspect. As a scholar who has been writing a lot about press freedom in the Arab world and in the MENA region, I must also mention that there has been a worsening in the realm of freedoms in general and press freedom in particular in the midst and the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, with governments cracking down harder on opposition and on activists and on journalists in so many different ways. So we have seen also a worsening in the condition of freedoms in general and press freedom in particular, with the issuance of new cybercrime laws that really kind of criminalize many forms of online expression and many forms of interaction under the mantle of protecting society from disinformation and misinformation, which might be related to COVID-19. But in many cases, it's really just a cover up for not having any kind of narrative or any kind of story that might conflict with the official governmental narrative, which the government is very keen to have as the only narrative and the only voice which is being heard. So we have seen cases of newspapers being shut down, whether online newspapers or just a hard copy like print newspapers. We have seen media outlets that are being denied their license. We have seen journalists who are being arrested and jailed, including, of course, in some cases, elderly journalists who lost their lives also because of the imprisonment, plus the COVID-19 pandemic and being infected with the pandemic. We have seen foreign correspondents, in some cases, being denied their licenses or expelled from certain countries. All of these are realities now in the MENA region and in the Arab world that we also have to pay close attention to. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and definitely I'm very much looking forward to taking your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Khamis, for sharing all those thoughts with us. Let's move to you, Dr. Zarhouni. I'm glad the camera is working. We can see you now. During the presentation of Abdul-Wahab, we kept seeing Morocco as an outlier in different categories and in different criteria. Would you share with us your views on this, and especially on the trust in the government and the perception of freedom. Please, Dr. Zarhouani.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to contribute to this panel. And as it was mentioned by Abdul-Wahab, I was myself intrigued by the results of the Arab Barometer, especially that I could see Morocco really their top positions in different questions that were raised by the Arab Barometer. So this is why I would like to concentrate my comments around two sets of findings, views of the government and perceptions of freedom. So when it comes to views of the government, I think I have a few comments concerning at least three intriguing results I would like to mention, among which one was already mentioned by Abdul-Wahab in his presentation. The first one is really the results concerning the positive perception of Moroccans concerning the economic situation and how it was perceived as good. So I looked at the results of the fifth wave, and I could see a big difference between results of the survey conducted in 2018, according to which only 36% of Moroccans were happy about the situation. So for me, it was intriguing because we are still living significant impact of the pandemic, socio-economic impact of the pandemic. So this perception, and also as a Moroccan living in Morocco and following closely the results of other surveys and strategic analysis that were conducted by official state institutions, telling us that the impact on the social and economic situation in Morocco is huge. And here I would like to mention surveys conducted in 2020 and also during the first semester of this year by the HCP, the High Commissioner of Planning, and they are telling us that the economic situation is bad. So I was really wondering from where this perception came when we say 63% think that the economic situation is good. And also when I compared this result with the results from the fifth wave. Another intriguing result for me was that 67% of Moroccans seemed to be optimistic about the future of the situation, while at the same time, one tier, that is 31% of Moroccans, wishes to emigrate, and mainly for economic reasons, and especially among educated youth. And here I also made some comparison with results from the fifth wave, and I could see that there is a decrease in the percentage of those who would like to emigrate. So in 2018, as Abdul-Wahab knows very well, we had 44% of Moroccans who were willing really to emigrate either to Europe or North America, but mainly to other European countries. The similarity was that it's again the same age category. It's mainly among younger people that we have the largest group of people who would like to emigrate. And also what we call here, it represents a significant risk of brain drain because it's mainly about among educated youth. So this is something I think we should, the results are interesting in themselves, but we need to compare them. We need to, this historical perspective, and also to put them into context if we want to really understand them better. The third result when it comes to the views of the government is about the question that Ibrahim, you mentioned. It's about trust in the government. And here again, we notice that there is an increase. So the level of trust in the government is the highest among different countries, that is 48%. And also it's really high compared to the results from the fifth wave, according to which we had only 29% of Moroccans who had trust in the government. And really, when I saw the result, I think we need to make a distinction for at least the Moroccan case. My first thinking was, well, this increase in trust, we can relate it to the fact that the government did well in managing the pandemic. But again, the management, like all the decisions, good decisions to manage the pandemic were associated with the king, not with the government. So in the general perception, there is a narrative constructed by the official media. Whenever there was a good decision to benefit the citizenry, it was associated with the monarch and not with the government. So the government, political parties, the parliament were again discredited during the management of this pandemic. And so really here again, I would like to ask Abdul-Wahab or to bring into the discussion the fact how perhaps these views coming from the ground, how can we interpret them? How can we understand them in light of this kind of existence or in light of this realities? The second set of findings I would like to comment on, and that will be very short, it's about the perceptions of freedom. So really, because we have journalists still, I'm speaking to you right now, and we have two journalists doing hunger strikes, that is Omar Radi and Raisouni. There were really protests were harshly repressed by the government during the past 2 years. So when you tell me that according to the sixth wave, 71% of respondents say that freedom to express is guaranteed to a greater or medium extent, and that 65% say that the freedom of the press is guaranteed, and that really 55% say that freedom to participate in peaceful protest and demonstration is guaranteed. I really have a big question mark there concerning this result. And I can tell you at a certain point, who responded to these questions in that manner? But not to say, I'm raising this kind of issues, perhaps really to try to think perhaps the importance of taking into account elements from the context. So we cannot analyze statistical data without looking into the context and the situation and what's happening in reality. I think looking also at media coverage and the narratives that are constructed around certain issues in Morocco and also in other countries are really important to take into account when trying to analyze the results of this kind of surveys. And I would like to end with one question. To what extent views from the ground, because this is what we're talking about today, are disconnected from the ground? And I will end my presentation there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing those nuances and insights. Very, very interesting. Let's move to the Q&A. And the first question, I think, Abdul-Wahab, probably you can answer that. It's from our colleague, Dave Pollock of the Washington Institute. And he says, how do you explain that Libyans are the least likely to desire immigration?
Thank you, Ibrahim. To be honest, I'm in the presence of regional experts and people who know these countries a lot better than I do. I'm not very comfortable offering interpretations of like country-specific findings, but I think Libya has a strong economic basis. It has a lot of natural resources, and there's a lot of optimism after the formation of the government in March about Libya's future, about Libya's economic future. And Libya historically has not been one of the countries that we've seen the highest levels of desire to immigration. I mean, the highest levels have been, as Salwa mentioned, Sudan, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. Libya was never one of the leaders in terms of the countries that express desire to migrate. So you know, I that would be my personal interpretation, but I would invite country experts such as Salwa to really dig into the findings with the critical lens. I mean, if I want to just respond to some of the issues that Salwa raised, which are very valid, you know, that we always get this question of you know, do the perceptions reflect the situation on the ground accurately? And I mean, if you look at the perceptions of freedom, it's impossible that, like, you know, objectively speaking, you know, Morocco does not have the same level of freedoms that Lebanon does, for example. You know, so how come that Morocco is leading the pack, whereas Lebanon is at the very, you know, end of the pack, right? And my answer to that would be that, you know, we measure perceptions, we don't measure, you know, there are other, you know, quantitative indices of freedoms and, like, you know, Freedom House and these kinds of things. We measure to what extent, you know, citizens evaluate, you know, their environments, and we never claim that this is an accurate reflection of the, you know, the concrete objective fact on the ground. But if, you know, there is something quite telling with the fact that Moroccans, despite the Raisuni and Radi and Bouashrin persecutions, you know, evaluate their level of freedom higher than the Lebanese do, for example. You know, and then this is where we want country experts to come and explain these numbers. Is it fear? Is it that Moroccans are fearful? Is it that you know, Moroccans feel a sense of performance legitimacy? They're, you know, these phone interviews, these were phone interviews. Does the mode impact, you know, their level of responses versus face-to-face? And here I just want to note that we are not comparing our sixth wave with previous waves because of the different mode, and the different mode really does make it a different, you know, completely different survey. But I would like to add that, you know, we measured our results with the Moroccan Institute for Policy Analysis, MIPA, carried out their own trust index, their own survey, and their numbers track very closely with ours, which gave us more confidence in ours. Again, this is not to reflect that, you know, the Moroccan government, for example, you know, really hit it out of the ballpark with the COVID-19 management. But, you know, in comparison to these other countries, it did succeed. And, you know, we saw, for example, in Jordan, trust in government was 66% in the first time we asked the question in September, because the Jordanian government really was, you know, succeeding in the COVID-19 pandemic. When we asked again in March or April, it was 46%, which reflected the change. I mean, this is a 20% change to reflect not only that the pandemic situation got worse, but that people felt that the government did not manage it as effectively. They were not giving it as much priority. They did not have, you know, daily media appearances, etc., and so forth. So I mean, I would invite all country experts to dig into our data and to analyze them and to be critical of them, but also to take into account the fact that, you know, the context, the mode, and other measures were available. And you know, the presence of the MIPA Trust Index really makes me feel more comfortable about the results and more confident about them.
If I could just...
Yes, please go ahead. And also, if you could, there is a specific question for you, Dr. Khamis. So let me add that to you, and probably can combine them. The question is from Ashaya. She says, or he, I'm sorry, excuse my ignorance. You pointed out that COVID-19 exacerbated existing structural and logistical obstacles for women. Do you think that forces, whether governmental or non-governmental, acknowledged it in shaping their response to the pandemic, and why? Great question. Please, Dr. Khamis.
Yeah, thank you so much. First, let me start by just making a quick comment about this whole idea of the respondents and, you know, whether this result is accurate or not. You know, I'm a qualitative researcher and I do a lot of ethnographic work. And I think that the point about the mode of the question itself being over the phone in the form of a survey. Of course, we can get some great insights on some issues. But when you talk about issues as controversial and as sensitive as how satisfied are you with your government, we cannot deny the fact that there is still a lot of fear, right? A lot of apprehension in the Arab world, in the MENA region, about answering these types of politically sensitive questions. I would put myself in the place of many of the respondents, and maybe I would not be comfortable stating my real impression or my real feelings about the performance of my own government, or how satisfied am I with the level of allowed freedom, right? So maybe now that the pandemic is starting to maybe regress a little bit, and we hope so, we can maybe start to combine the mode of questions like over the phone. And I think Abdul-Wahab himself acknowledged that some of the shortcomings of this mode of questioning, we can actually start to combine it with some other forms of, for example, data collection and data gathering, maybe by triangulating the survey questions with some kind of in-depth ethnographic field research, face-to-face interviews, having some kind of in-depth discussions. And I think that would bring about some more in-depth insight, and maybe some of these views will also be altered, and some of the results and findings will be changed. Also, in terms of Morocco and Lebanon, sometimes when there's more freedom in a country, people will talk more freely and criticize and critique their governments more so than in countries which have more limited freedoms, where people will be more afraid to talk. So that can be another layer of interpretation. Now, moving to the question that was particularly addressed to me, I think that's a great question. I think that unfortunately, a lot of governments in the region are not still up till this moment in time taking these aspects we discussed very seriously or sufficiently into consideration moving forward. There is still this mode of denial. We have been doing great, even denial when it comes to the accuracy of the data which is being provided to the public about how many cases of COVID-19 is there in a country, how many people actually died, how many people got infected, how many vaccines do you have, how many people got vaccinated. Even this level of information and data is oftentimes missing or not available, or it is inaccurate, incomplete, or I should say, in some cases, even false. And if you, as a journalist or an activist or an opponent or whatever your role may be, you try to expose some of these shortcomings or some of these discrepancies or some of these gaps or some of the inaccuracies or simply falsehoods, you might end up in a very dark place, being, imprisoned, harassed, you lose your job, you may be fired, you may be expelled, you may live the rest of your life in exile. And of course, there are varying degrees of that in different countries in the region. We cannot put everybody in the same basket. And we cannot use a one-size-fits-all strategy when we talk about different countries. Obviously, Lebanon is different from Kuwait, different from Morocco. We should be sensitive in terms of not putting everyone in the same basket. But to make a short answer here, unfortunately, I think that there is still much more need for the governments to seriously consider many of the issues we discussed today in terms of the marginalized groups, in terms of gender inequities, in terms of disparities, and to put that into the future planning and strategic planning. I don't think that this has been done sufficiently up till this moment, unfortunately.
Let me also add this question from Anne to you quickly. What do you see the future of women's prospects post-COVID, Dr. Khamis?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think of COVID as really this double-edged sword for women, right? We talked about a lot of the negative implications and negative effects, like, women's situation became worse economically, socially, educationally. But there is also some silver lining in this dark cloud. And the silver lining is an opportunity for leadership. So some women started to step up. They started to take some leadership positions, to lead NGOs, local organizations, to become community activists, to become organizers, to have a more vocal voice, to raise some of these concerns about women's inequities and gender disparities. So I see it also not just as a threat, but I also see it as an opportunity. Now, women have to get organized. Women's movements in the MENA region and the Arab world, unfortunately, have not been organized sufficiently, and there has not been sufficient coordination between their efforts, whether locally or regionally. They need to get more organized, more coordinated, but I see this really as a double-edged sword. Yes, we do have the threats. Yes, we have the downsides. We discussed that already, but there is also a great opportunity if women can take advantage of it and make the best out of it. And I always say, if women are not at the table, they will be on the menu. So to avoid being on the menu, we have been on the menu for a long time, we have to be at the decision-making table, and that's a good opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sahar. Salwa, to you, there are two questions you probably could answer. One from Mark. And he says, given the high reliance on various social media for news and other information, does that partly explain the perception of not trusting the government? And the second question from Luke, do MENA countries have the economic and structural means to implement fiscal and monetary policy to address inflation and recession, as well as to increase investments?
Can you please repeat the second question?
The second one, yes, of course, and I'll put it for you in the in the panel's chat. So, do MENA countries have the economic and structural means to implement fiscal and monetary policy to address inflation and recession, as well as to increase investment? So the question about if they have the structural means to implement and develop those policies.
Okay. Well, thank you for this very interesting questions. I didn't have time to mention when I was speaking about perceptions of the media, how the fact that the Moroccan state is locking down the traditional classical venues of expression like freedom of the press, how many Moroccans are really turning or expressing themselves mainly and their grievances mainly via social media, exactly because of state control or repression of voices who are critical elsewhere. So I think that to answer Mark's question, yes, social media is used to express criticism vis-a-vis the government. But what we have noticed also during past years is that this venue is also used to express criticism vis-a-vis the king, vis-a-vis the monarchy. So this is a space which is not necessarily under tight control of the state, and that Moroccans are using, different categories of Moroccan are using really to express their criticism. But behind, I don't think that it's mainly social media. I think there is a narrative that was constructed by official media concerning the fact that the monarchy as an institution is the most efficient compared to the government and politicians that are really portrayed as very often as not corrupted, not necessarily doing their work, instrumentalizing whatever developmental projects initiated by the king to serve their own interests. I think there has been a consistent narrative in the official media concerning this dichotomy between the king as the developer, the king as the reformer, and political elites in general as not necessarily doing their jobs and as corrupted. And of course, social media contributes to, has contributed to really also to sharing this kind of narratives among different categories of Moroccans. I have to say that I cannot answer the second question concerning strategical means in MENA countries in general, because this is a huge question to answer, but I can say a few words about the Moroccan case. In Morocco, there has been reforms again initiated by the monarchy, either in the field of regionalization as a means to counter spatial disparities in Morocco, and also as a means to develop different marginalized regions, to develop economically speaking. I think we have launched a debate on fiscal reforms, but I think, and I would like here to say something that was also mentioned in the results of the barometer. I think there is one main obstacle, to mention only one, and which is a structural obstacle to economic development and to increasing investment in Morocco, and that is the high level of corruption. Corruption be it when we speak about political institution, but also when it comes to the economic field. I think also a result of this sixth wave of the Arab Barometer was that for a majority of Moroccans, and also I think in different countries such as Tunisia, I don't have the results right now, but perhaps Abdul-Wahab can say a few words about this. But corruption is still predominant in Morocco, and it is a structural obstacle to economic development and to investment.
Thank you very much. Our time is up, but I would like to give a minute for this question. Abdul-Wahab, if you could answer Justin's question. And he says, I find it worrying, what I find worrying is the high levels of dissatisfaction with government performance in the Middle East and North Africa's few democracies relative to their authoritarian counterparts. Is this a product of COVID-19? And what do these findings mean for the future of democracy in the region? Big question, but if you could answer in less than a minute, I would appreciate that.
In less than a minute, the future of democracy in the Middle East is in as much jeopardy as it is in the rest of the world. I don't think the Middle East is an exception with regards to where the future of democracy and the problems that we're facing around the world. But I will say very quickly that yes, we've seen that satisfaction in Tunisia with the government, because Tunisia is the only successful democratizing case that we measure. We have seen that satisfaction with government provided services is low, but I think that's partially a reflection of the frustration that democracy is not a panacea. It does not solve your developmental problems. It does not reverse authoritarian legacies of decades in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Democracy is a process by which you improve your governance, but doesn't mean that your developmental indicators of education, healthcare, employment are going to just be solved overnight. So I think the results partially are a reflection of that frustration, but also one thing that my fellow panelists mentioned, that people feel the freedom in Tunisia to criticize the government without fear of persecution, without fear of somebody knocking on their door and asking them, why did you answer this and why did you answer that? And I think the results need to be taken into that consideration. When we see that the evaluations of the government are worse in Tunisia, Iraq, and Lebanon, that's not a surprise, because the citizens in Tunisia, Iraq, and Lebanon feel more freedom to criticize the government than in the rest of the countries that we study. And so, in brief, nobody thinks that authoritarianism in the region will provide any future solutions. Nobody thinks that the developmental problems that the region faces are better tackled with authoritarianism than democracy. But democracy is not just going to reverse decades and decades of authoritarian governance and misallocation of resources, and it requires a little more patience and historical perspective.
Thank you very much, Abdul-Wahab. It's 11:02. Our time is up. I really appreciate the great presentation you provided us with. And Dr. Khamis and Dr. Zarhouni, thank you very much for your comments, thoughts, and insights. You really told us a lot in such a short period of time. Thank you for everyone who attended this panelist, and for the communications team at MEI, especially Jess and Coco. And hopefully we will host you in other events soon at the Middle East Institute. Have a good day, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.